Barnwell here with my old compatriot Douglas Gabriel, and I've decided to make this the maiden voyage of my new effort on YouTube for the American Intelligence Media Conclave Annex. And I thought it would be very timely, especially in light of current events, to try and give some kind of a picture of what we've been developing as a narrative through all the various efforts through Douglas and Tyler and Michael McKibben and his researchers at Americans for Innovation regarding the Crowngate conspiracy, which is really the greatest criminal conspiracy in U.S. history, spanning essentially a couple hundred years or even longer, and what the implications might be and how people could develop their understanding and hopefully not just be spectators, because the spectators rooted in the word specter, and that means ghost. It's just like this passive watching. It's like you're part of the audience, and I would hope that people would take a more active, proactive role in being able to get this information out there, because there's so many people running around today that have very strong opinions about things they can't even explain, and that is a real red flag. So Douglas, hello there, my friend.
Hello, John. It's so good you're going to bring the skeletons out of the closet, because there's a bunch of them in Britain. I'm glad to be here. And, I just want to start off by saying the work you've done with exposing this. I guess you'll explain these technical things, but just the work you've done for exposing Crowngate through your Twitter account alone has been quite impressive. You've really learned to communicate to people not only with a picture and an image, but with the exact right amount of content that they can handle to absolutely explode their brain with a good red pill. So thanks for that good work.
Well, without all the commiserating that you and I have done over the last 45 years or so, none of that would have been possible. This is kind of a side project that developed out of our monastic club back in the late 70s, to where we had our own kind of quasi think tank trying to figure out a true path to freedom and what that might imply and what other forces were that were playing into this narrative. And it was also around that time that I became aware of the works of Professor Carol Quigley from Georgetown University. And that was at the same time that we were researching so much regarding what Rudolf Steiner had indicated around the turn of the century, last century, regarding the workings of the brotherhoods, so to speak, in the West. And they're working behind the scenes and trying to have tremendous impact on global events, which, as we've developed our research, we've been able to access primary documents to elevate this far beyond the typical conspiracy theories that you will see all over the place. And so consequently, what I did was I created a storyline, a Twitter thread, to where I could serve as an outline so that people could frame this. Because if you don't come to terms with being able to create something within a proper context, then you could be creating more harm than good. You're just causing somebody to cower in the corner in fear, when actually our opponents, it's sufficient to defeat them just by laughing at them and letting them cower in the corner in fear, because they're probably just some nerd sitting in his bathrobe at a computer. And so, consequently, dealing with these bugaboos has been quite a challenge, and I'd hoped that we could further this through using multi platforms, and really that your gifted wife, Tyler Gabriel, is can be credited with the nexus that we've been able to create here through computers, and of course. None of that would have been possible without the capabilities that have arisen from Michael McKibben and his co-workers at Leader Technology, who created the possibility for scalability so that millions upon millions of people could simultaneously interact on the internet. Before he came along, at the most 60 people could interact at one time, and now
how's it going?
Through the capability of scaling on the internet that was stolen through some of the things we'll get to explaining at some point in one of these dialogues, which we've explained before on, but there could be some new people coming to this information. And so what we want to touch on in this is how we've been able to put together a storyline that ties into events that there's an important point of creation in 1902 with the Pilgrims Society that has two organizations, one in London and the other in New York. And then there's the 1909 conference, the Imperial Press Conference that occurred in 1909 that led to the Empire Press Union and all of these various tools that arose, including the whole octopus of the intelligence community that actually arose out of these media conglomerates centered primarily in London, but also in the US, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Chicago Tribune, and other media, and also in Canada with Sir William Stevenson and his Canadian Broadcasting Company. And he was really the person. It's interesting because his name's not listed in those meetings, but yet he was the person who actually was the liaison between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Crown in England. And he served as the person that was able to put together the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom and its latest morphogenesis as the OSS and the CIA and their relationship to MI6 and MI5. And we also have to throw into the mix the FBI and all the other branches of intelligence, because this is really what is going on right now in this whole struggle. And there's all other levels of criminality that one can associate it with this regarding trafficking in drugs, people, information, technology theft, and on and on. So, Douglas, if you could give us some insights to let the listener know your background and being able to access and be able to comprehend some of this information.
Well, I'd have to blame that on you and your buddies who started the Romantic Futurists a few hundred years ago. I forget, you're a bunch of old guys. And I was the young guy in the group. And you basically had a vision of the future where you took what some would call the Western esoteric spiritual Christian path and tried to integrate it into the modern world. And basically that's what we're trying to do. Use the capacities that are developed through spiritual self-development to look at the world and to truly hone your skills of discernment so that you can tell what's true. I always like to say, you can hear truth ring in your heart, not in your head. Don't listen and don't try to use your head to discern truth. Use your heart. And with enough years of being a Waldorf teacher and singing and dancing and doing all the wonderful things that I got to do for all those years as principal and superintendent, I learned to basically see the simple realities, and the simpler you can make it, the better. So when I was in the National Security Agency, drafted back in the early 70s, I was involved with basically the weaponization of microwave, the weaponization of telemetry, the weaponization of every type of what we called electronic warfare at that time, including computers. And so I got my hands deeply involved in that, and it then made me kind of go the opposite direction afterwards and became a Waldorf teacher. So my experience is simply the experience of life, but having been a principal, and I think, you worked in those schools right alongside with me sometimes, and you get to see that you see just about everything thrown at a principal that there is. It's kind of like being the president of the United States. So when the issues that Donald Trump faces all the time, I always think, oh my goodness, on a very tiny, tiny scale, these are the same kind of personnel management issues that we had to face as a superintendent. At one point, I had 28 schools under my supervision, and a bunch of them were for adjudicated youth. So I've seen both the rich private school side all the way right down into the inner city sad side of handling adjudicated youth. So if that's what you're talking about, that's what gives me a little bit of credence to say that. But I have a lot of strange experiences, as you know, throughout my life. But what we're trying to do here, and the reason I took on the name Thomas Paine in the Ass of the Globalists, is one day Tyler turned to me and said, I don't believe this story that they're giving us on San Bernardino. And I refused to look at it because I was writing some spiritual book or whatever. And so she said, no, really, I want you to look at this. How do you know I'm not interested? And she said, no, I really want you to look at this. So I looked and I said, well, I can tell you right now, it's a complete false flag and a false flag. I see 6 different pictures of the same exact event. And this is basically perception management. And she said, what are you talking about? I said, well, this is what we use in the military. It's what we do to create what they call spin or the narrative. And it's simply perception management. We make sure you're confused. We make sure that we're speaking from a position of authority. We make sure to use what you already believe against you. And we turn basically anything into a weaponized form of propaganda. And that was one of the things in electronic warfare that I did witness a lot when I worked for the National Security Agency. So when we are turned that kind of attention, along with yourself and the whole conclave and all the different researchers and all these different people on the Betsy's team in terms of our political blogs, we now are connected to so many people that all work together to try to simply raise consciousness, because I think that's what you're insinuating. Raising consciousness is the solution, no matter how you want to look at it. And it doesn't take a lot of people. It takes a small handful of people. And as we've often pointed out, if you could get rid of 36 people out of Washington, D.C., the entire corruptocrat system would collapse. 36 people. But they would be, shockingly, the biggest leaders who tout their ethics and their morality through their pathetic propaganda of the mainstream media. They're the ones they tell us are the most honest. They aren't. They're the most corrupt.
Yeah, that's a great summation. My computer was talking to me.
I heard it talking.
Yeah,
I was wondering if you were going to answer.
In chatter speak, and I'm afraid I'm not very well versed in chatter speak. So
well, actually, that's what I did in the military. It's funny that you come up. I could listen to any signal, and I could tell you what it was. I could tell you how many channels there were. I could probably tell you the encryption around it, and instantaneously, that's what they trained us to do. Eventually, I trained a machine to do that and replaced a lot of humans with just some machines that could do it. And we spied on Russia. They were so far behind us that we gave them the technology so that they could catch up to us, so that when we spied on them, it actually made sense. And now we do it for China, but we do it by basically giving them all of the IP through the communists who are running our country. And Hillary and Bill Clinton are Chinese and Russian communists. This isn't a theory. This is a fact. That's who they got paid by. And we can see that, Kissinger's a communist. There's a lot of people, Eric Schmidt, they've sold out to the new form of communism, China. And, the threat of Russia's hardly a threat anymore. But China had almost overtaken America, and no one had hardly even noticed. We were screaming about it, but others weren't.
Well, when you get into this whole thing, people stub their toe on words like communism and capitalism, fashion, all these various isms. They're really the children of the 20th century, where they had an ideological basis that they were using to put forward and motivate people to take action. And it was much easier back then, of course, because basically the octopus, we'll call it, had control of all the media outlets. And so they could basically tell people what they wanted them to think. They were in place in the universities. They were writing the history books that people would use to be able to come to an understanding of historical events. And as we know, history is written by conquerors. So that if you want to get underneath the hood, so to speak, you have to really do your own research, because when you get into, for example, so many of the historians, if you look and if you've done any study of history, and I used to teach history in a master's program, so that training teachers to become teachers, and with my specialization in history. And if you don't go to primary texts, which now we have the capability to do much easier, but if you don't go to the primary text, you're stuck with taking the interpretation that's been spoon-fed to you by people like Arnold Toynbee or Winston Churchill, or just a handful of writers really are the ones that are at the center of the entire model of history. And really, it wasn't until certain information started to come forth from this cabal itself that there started to be a greater awakening, although there had been glimmerings of it obviously from people like Rudolf Steiner, and before him from Madame Blavatsky and C.G. Harrison, and all these pretty arcane sources. I mean, geez, when you consider C.G. Harrison and the information that he put out regarding the Dark Brotherhoods in the West way back in the late 1800s, you're talking about a book of which I've only seen 2 physical copies, okay? And I had one of them, and a friend of mine had the other one, and I guess that's the one that ended up being reprinted by Rudolf Steiner Press. But C.G. Harrison, if anybody wants to come to a backdrop, his book, Transcendental Universe, which is, you can read it over on archive.org. But there's physical copies available with a wonderful introduction by Christopher Bamford that can give you some idea of the way in which cult brotherhoods work behind the scenes and attempt to control the great cycles of history and what their agenda might be. And so consequently, this is where we came to this. This is the studies that we were approaching and understanding the machinations of the Jesuits. It was really starting from Madame Blavatsky, talking about the Jesuits and how the Jesuits had killed her close associate Paulos Metamon in Cyprus way back in the 1860s. And then you get into the other individuals that point towards the poisoning of Rudolf Steiner back in 1924. You can go back and you can look at these things and you can see that there's this secret agenda that's been working through history and attempting to hem us in and limit our choices. And that what this is a system of control. So, what we'll call it is a collectivism. And you may call it communism, fascism, whatever you want, but it's basically how the elites want to be in control of the masses. And the more centralized the system is, the more susceptible it is to abuse. And that's why great overarching institutions like the UN, for example, they're a great danger to humanity. It's not necessarily that there's people that are interacting and talking, because that's an important thing. But to give this organization actual power is the greatest error that you could possibly make. Like, for example, what's going on right now with climate change. The whole agenda behind this whole climate change narrative has to do with the carbon credit system and create a financing structure to be able to finance the United Nations as a worldwide global dominant force. And how anybody can't see that is quite remarkable, whether or not there is climate change. Of course, there's climate change. There's climate change all the time. But to say that it has to do with carbon dioxide, their formulas are off, their predictions have been off, and yet they just keep marching ahead as if it's true. It could be quite terrifying to somebody who doesn't have sufficient education to be able to look behind what's being presented, for example, by that young girl at the UN who's has her own challenges, and how she's being supported and traveling around in a yacht that formerly belonged to one of the Rothschilds. You just have to go, okay, I see that it seems as if you keep looking close enough, you're going to start to see that there's a small cast of characters that are at the core of this whole dilemma. And it ties into many of the groups that we've been able to pinpoint, the actual documents proving their existence, proving how they work together, why they work together, how they work through trusts and offshore bank accounts, and the way it ties into the central banking system, the City of London, the City of the Vatican and Washington, D.C., and this whole corporate superstructure that gives them a means to disguise their activities as if they were something that has to do with being a governmental institutions, which very rarely they are. They're normally private institutions that have managed to figure out a legal framework where they can insert themselves into what was meant to be a really a source of liberty and liberation for mankind into being just another encumbrance.
I'm convinced that the British East India Company, those mercantile pirates, took over the British government with the help of the Privy Council. And what we have discovered, the imperialism of basically Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner, and continuing on to this day. And I wonder if Giuseppe Mazzini had anything to do with it, John, because I think they're pirates, and I think that they became the Pilgrim Society, and I wonder if anyone besides us seemed to notice it. We brought forth the evidence showing that essentially that's what it is: pirates.